Hello, Namaste. Yesterday we had a 9 minute session, and as a continuation of that, let me now speak on the same topic, Indic thought and contemporary relevance. I told I would like to call that as contemporary issues in Indic knowledge studies. One important thing I probably forgot to mention was that the main aim of the course is to see why Indic knowledge studies, the way we are doing it now, did not happen earlier, right from the beginning of modern education, and particularly modern education of Sanskrit, or even the traditional education of Sanskrit during the modern period. Why Indic knowledge studies did not happen, if it did not happen, or even if it happened, what were the limitations of that happening, why it did not happen the way it should have happened, why we are in need of doing it now if it did not happen, or why we are in need of doing it differently than how it happened earlier if it happened the way it should not have happened. So throughout the period, at every stage, at every period, what we are going to observe, what we are going to focus on is these two issues, whether Indic knowledge studies happened at that stage or not. For example, at this stage of early modern interest in Sanskrit and studies in Sanskrit by the Europeans, let me tell you, Indic knowledge studies did not happen. Whatever happened was the study of Sanskrit as a language, or Sanskrit as literature, or study of Vedas. Why Indic knowledge studies did not happen at that stage was because of Eurocentrism, colonialism and Orientalism, by which what we mean basically is that the attitude of the Europeans of this early modern stage, early modern period, was that Vedas were the songs of the primitive people. They had romantic poetry in them. The words that the scholars that I was mentioning, Professor Max Muller or MacDonnell, they used may appear to be great praise towards Vedas or Sanskrit, but inherently the Orientalist, the Eurocentric, the colonialist attitude of saying that they were the primitive poetry of the primitive people was inherent in them. And the word primitive, as you know, is a value-loaded term with an attitude of looking down upon the people. So, for them to say that the Vedas had scientific knowledge in that is wrong, because science for them is the new way of thinking coming from Enlightenment period, post 18th century, and it was taken for granted that knowledge would always evolve. That is what we call evolutionism. Knowledge, if it was there earlier, some centuries ago or millennia ago, it has to be by definition lower in level, lower in standard than the present science, because the present science has to be the final product of a long evolutionary process right from the primitive man. So the knowledge of primitive man has to be by definition a linearly backward, linearly earlier level, lower level of knowledge. So what Vedas could have documented or could have recorded also should by definition be a lower level knowledge. So at the most it was poetry basically. It was just songs of praise of nature forms or nature scenery and all that. So there is no scope for, with that attitude, there is no scope for taking sciences from the Vedas. Or even if you go to Laukika Samskrita, what we call, or they call that as Sanskrit, and the language of the Vedas is different from Sanskrit. So for them, what we call Laukika Samskrita, that is the Samskrita of Vyasa, Valmiki, Kalidasa and other poets, and that period, later to Vedic period, Sanskrit, even that for them was not science at all. Even if there was any knowledge contained in that literature, for them, as I already told you, evolutionarily it has to be backward. It has to be an older level of knowledge, a pre-scientific understanding. And basically, for example, what we call darshanas now, orthodox schools of Indian philosophy, what is being called today, was in that early modern period was called just religion. People were not even ready to agree that there was something called philosophy in that. They called it religion, they called it metaphysics. They did not even allow the status of philosophy to that. So any other knowledge contained in Sanskrit literature has to be a backward level of knowledge, lower level of knowledge. That was the attitude. So that's why Indic knowledge studies, the way we are talking about it now, was not possible to happen during this period, what we call early modern period. And then you come to these modern Indian educational institutes. Here we are talking of Sanskrit in modern schools. Universities were introduced in India. And in Indian universities, Sanskrit departments were started. In the Indian universities, they wanted to follow the model that they followed in their own universities, where they had departments of classical languages, and for them classical languages were Greek and Latin. So they thought, similar to that, some classical languages are to be taught here, and equivalent to Greek and Latin, they considered Sanskrit and Persian to be the classical languages here. So in the name of classical languages, they introduced departments of Sanskrit. And departments of Sanskrit in Indian universities were modeled after the departments of Greek, departments of Latin, departments of English or German or those European languages. So did they, for example, use the department of Greek or department of Latin in their universities as a source of Greek knowledge studies? I don't think. Or Latin knowledge studies? No. For them, Department of English, for example, was the Department of English Literature. At the most, Department of English Language also, apart from Department of English Literature. But they did not consider the Department of English Language or Department of English Literature as the Department of English Knowledge Studies to extract knowledge or sciences from English language. So if it did not happen to English, if it did not happen to French or German, how can it happen to Sanskrit? So the Sanskrit departments also were considered to be departments which are not supposed to be studying these knowledge studies, in the knowledge systems. For them, Department of Sanskrit was something like Department of Marathi or Department of Telugu or Department of Tamil, where you study literature. One thing that was a little different in Sanskrit departments was that things like Nyaya or Mimamsa or Vyakarana or Vedanta were also considered to be part of the activity of the Department of Sanskrit, which was not there in the departments of Marathi or Tamil or Telugu. But nevertheless, even those were considered to be Shastras as different from sciences, Shastras as different from philosophy. So it was considered that Nyaya is to be taught or Mimamsa is to be taught as a traditional Shastra as part of the Department of Sanskrit. When you come to the stage of traditional schools, Veda, Shastra and Sanskrit Pathashalas, Gurukula style of education at the Guru's home, these two were the two modes of education at that time. Even here, Indic knowledge studies was not happening. Let me tell you one thing. For them, what we consider as Indic knowledge, for example, the darshanas or the Indic knowledge studies of the knowledge management type and all that, but definitely they consider them to be logical systems of knowledge and all that. But what we are trying to see is that whether they considered them to be useful for contemporary life, then from that perspective, no, they did not. They considered Nyaya, Mimamsa or Vyakarana to be part of the traditional Sanskrit education, which was useful for the traditional way of life of the Hindus or the Indians. That's how they looked at it. They thought when it comes to modern education or modern way of life, what the British were teaching in the schools as knowledge was what was useful. For example, for official drafting, the clerical drafting in the offices, in the bureaucracy, how can Sanskrit be useful? Or how can, for example, Sanskrit be useful in wars, in fighting, because the weapons that are used are different than the weapons that are described in Sanskrit education. So for them, all that they were able to see in the form of British way of life was alien. I wouldn't even say that they considered all that to be good thing that was happening and Sanskrit was a bad thing that happened earlier. So this bad thing called Sanskrit was not useful for the good thing. No. Some of them even had a negative attitude towards what was happening in the name of the British way of life. They considered all that to be bad. Some of them considered that to be aprachya. Prachya is the word used in the sense of Oriental, the Eastern. So for what is Occidental, the Western, they use the word aprachya, not prachya, aprachya. And the word aprachya was a bad word. It was used as an abusive word. They used to consider all that was happening post-British in the Indian way of life to be something bad. Quite natural. Any society, when a new culture comes, naturally that new culture of the outsiders, the other people, is considered to be something encroaching into their own way of life or something different, something bad and all that. So in the same way these people had that. So when you have that attitude that was what was happening was not something good, so there is no question of thinking of making your knowledge, your traditional knowledge of Nyaya, Vyakarana or Vedanta, how that will be useful for this bad thing is not possible to be thought of. So that was one of the reasons. Not that all of them considered that to be bad, just as it happens all over. The ruler's knowledge is always considered to be superior, ruler is considered to be the winner, winner's knowledge is considered to be the winning knowledge. So there was always this attitude of worship or veneration or fascination towards the Western education, even among the traditional Sanskrit scholars. So among those scholars who had that attitude of veneration or respect towards the winning culture, winning in the sense of the ruler's culture, for them Sanskrit education was something backward, and they had this inferiority, low self-esteem towards their own Sanskrit education, and they thought, what can I do? All that I know is only this. Maybe this is not useful for the contemporary life, the English life, the British life, the modern life, but I like it because that's traditional for me. I enjoy the rigor in it, but that rigor is not useful for this society. So I'm a conservative person. What can I do? I live this old culture, the traditional culture. Let me continue in